Good afternoon. We would like to thank Adam Benford, the organizer of this symposium, for the opportunity to present our talk in this format, as we were unable to participate in person. Social movements and grassroots organizations led by indigenous and Afro-descendant women in Latin America play a vital role in sustaining strategies of solidarity, safeguarding ancestral knowledge and cultural practices, and leading the conservation and sustainable management of forest ecosystems. A historical trajectory marked by struggles for social justice and equity, Afro-Latin and indigenous women have increasingly gained political representation. Their presence now extends across national and international organizations, including the United Nations. They also actively support initiatives such as the Xingu Indigenous Land Association Women's Project, the March of Indigenous Women in Brazil, and the National Coordinator of Black Women of Ecuador, among others. This presentation is developed in reference to the international seminar Indigenous and Afro-Descendant People in the Americas, Collaboration, Archaeology, Repatriation, Cultural Heritage, which took place online in 2024 with the theme Building Afro-Indigenous Affective Networks, Women, Education, and Activism in Latin America. Over the past 5 centuries, the interactions between indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities have been characterized by complex entanglements, shaped by both personal and collective relationships, including alliances, kinship ties, exchanges, intimacies, and conflicts. Nevertheless, the systematic silencing of their histories by colonial bureaucracies has produced multidirectional impacts on society, reinforcing structural inequalities and hindering the recognition of collective rights across the Americas, with adverse effects on women. As social archaeologists and anthropologists involved in collaborative, community-based initiatives, we underscore the significance of fostering connections between the traditional knowledge systems and archaeological praxis. At the heart of this work are community-led partnerships that value oral tradition and memory-building practices, helping to promote decolonizing pedagogies. The central objectives of this discussion in our projects are to create learning environments that respect indigenous and Afro-descendant narratives and their oral modes of knowledge transmission, to develop strategies for transforming formal education by incorporating linguistic diversity and methodologies that foster critical and independent thinking, and to strengthen initiatives grounded in women's solidarity. One pertinent example of indigenous women's organizing in Brazil can be observed in 2024, when researchers from the National Coordination of Indigenous Women Warriors of Ancestrality and the Socio-Environmental Institute conducted a comprehensive national mapping initiative. This research identified 249 indigenous women's organizations operating across 21 states in Brazil, which demonstrates the growing influence of these networks and underscores their expanding role in the country's socio-political landscape. To better understand the historical and contemporary interaction between indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, we draw on 2 key definitions. The first is the idea of confluence, as proposed by Antonio Bispo dos Santos, which describes relationships grounded in mutual recognition, where different ancestral experiences and cosmologies flow together without erasing their specificities. Alongside confluence, we also draw on the concept of solidarity. Cranach states that indigenous peoples are alliance-based societies with regards to their daily life and the understanding of the world. But they must be thought of very carefully, as they are not societies that accept the erasure of their identity in the world. nor the formation of a homogeneous group. We also remarked how these traditional communities have long been preserving forest integrity and promoting biodiversity through various initiatives, often led by women. These efforts sustain networks, ensure food sovereignty, and transmit knowledge across generations. Such practices are key acts of resistance and align with the perspectives of indigenous women in Brazil and Afro-Ecuadorian women, as discussed in the following videos by Catarina dos Santos and Katherine Chalá, particularly concerning decolonizing pedagogies.
My name is Catarina Delfina dos Santos, Cunha in Bopuruá. I live in the Tapirema indigenous land in the state of São Paulo. In 1979, if I'm not mistaken, I met the people from CIMI, and CIMI is an organization who allowed me to travel around and to really become an activist. I fell in love with this fight because I could finally really understand the reality of my relatives, my indigenous relatives. In 84, 85, I went to Praça da Sé in São Paulo to collect signatures to help promote the new constitution of 88 after the dictatorship. Most of the people who were in that fight were men, and I was the only woman as alongside Helena Potiguara. By hearing about that story, I heard that I had to really fight for the rights of my people who had been there for so long and fight for women to have more of a voice in our meetings, our get-togethers, in education, in politics. But up to this day, I feel that very few women in the state of São Paulo here in Brazil really have a voice and are professionals in education and healthcare. We mostly have indigenous men doing that, but we are fighting for gender equality now. I'm now studying to be trained as, well, actually, I was trained to be a teacher, and we were trying to find some balance between the number of men and women. We make sure that we have the same number of students who identify as men and as women. In terms of this education, you mentioned within four walls, right? And that's how I studied. I was enclosed, and there were four walls around me because I was in a classroom. But in our traditional communities, we learn that education is something that is provided to us at OPA, which is the religious area. And that's where we are educated. We learn about our culture, what we can and can't do, what we must and must not do. We learn our practices. And this was something that I was very happy to do. And when I left my village and was put in a school, and in the year 2000, I went back to all of that. It's when I went back to the Piaçaguera indigenous territory. And I was named the leader of that territory. Actually, four different communities recognized me as their leader. And 1 year later, we had the new intercultural teachers training promoted by the University of São Paulo. And I was chosen by my community to take that training because I spoke both languages. I had completed high school. So I was chosen to take this intercultural teachers training at the University of São Paulo. So I had to spend 15 days at the University of São Paulo, 15 days at my village. But no one really recognized Tupi-Guarani. They said that we were only Guarani. But we had we spoke a different language from the one that they thought we did. So one of the things I had to fight for at university was the recognition of my specific ethnicity, the Tupi-Guarani ethnicity. But I had to really fight for that even inside university. I always tell professors, teachers, and my communities that we have to learn about our traditional ways. We have to actually revitalize our history and our language because our identity is intrinsically linked to that. And without identity, it is difficult to fight. As Watatakalu said, we have always been seen as poor communities in Brazil, but we are rich. We are rich in culture, in religion, in land. It is not, it hasn't been long since white people actually acknowledge that we have a soul and that we are just as human as anyone else. It doesn't matter whether you're black, whether you're German, French, whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes, we are all human beings. We are all equal in that sense. And this is also something that we had to fight for here in Ecuador because we are often erased from statistics. We can say it's almost a statistical genocide because it's as if we did not exist. But now we know that we are sometimes even in larger numbers in Ecuador than some indigenous communities. And if the fact that we had never been really recognized shows that we live in a deeply racist society. So we're now fighting for political representation and access to what we are entitled to. And we now suffer a crisis of recognition and representation that, of course, impacts public policies and how resources are allocated to different groups so that we can actually promote a more equal society. So these are fights that are historical. We are fighting for justice, we are fighting for equality, but we are also fighting against new forms of racism and discrimination and how we see our society accommodating different strategies so that they can perpetuate racism in new forms. And with that, I want to also mention the fact of land claims and another process that is very long lasting because when you talk about slavery, unfortunately, African descendant people in Ecuador, they were left with absolutely no means of having their own prosperity. Whereas even after slavery was ended, the slave owners, they were paid even indemnities for the slaves that were freed. So that comes to say that African American people had no access to the land where they have worked for so long. Say that we also have a right to land here in Ecuador. So that, and I believe that we could play an important role in an environmental friendly new way of production and to bring traditional production practices and collective ownership of the land so that we can develop our own methods of community, our own community organizations. Because the land is where we can really build a life that is more dignified for all of us. Land claims for us represents a very concrete concept where we can have a land to build a new community and we can build our own development. This is very important for our people. And when we went to school, we didn't hear anything about our own history, as if we were not subjects, we were not really active players in that story. And I'm very sad to say that we were not even part of the national curriculum. What we learned about ourselves were things that we learned from our own communities. We would sit in our own traditional parties and festivities where we learned about our history and about our traditional knowledge. And starting in the 90s, here in Ecuador, we really focused on a project called the Maroon Education. It was a axis of fight of African Ecuadorian peoples. As I was mentioning earlier, the idea was for the state that had silenced our existence and erased our history could recognize our existence, but we, as I mentioned, also wanted our own people to really appreciate our traditional knowledges, practices, customs, and perspectives on life, which are interconnected with reality, our territories. So everything is actually part of a single point of view, a single perspective of life.
Within the context provided by our colleagues and other collaborative publications, solidarity exhibit by these communities aligns with the guiding principles of major global organizations focused on inclusion, sustainability, social justice, and beyond. Furthermore, they are crucial in developing liberating education policies. These issues are central to the social transformation unfolding across our countries, territories, and communities worldwide, emphasizing the imperative to incorporate them into the national and international forums, including those within the social sciences and the archaeology fields. Thank you.